Hello, Dr. Elliot. It's really, really lovely to have you join us today on Between the Lines, which is really a platform where we're trying to connect African creatives and innovators to Northern Nigeria and beyond. And we're really, really so honored to have you join us today.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here and a great opportunity to speak to your audience, which hopefully will be
Yeah.
my audience.
Absolutely. I remember one time Googling you up and I saw all of these amazing things about you. And even just learning some words for the first time, like dramaturge. I'm like, okay, what does that mean? And I've listened to some of your interviews. It's just really phenomenal, and your perspective on like decolonializing, like dance and all of that is just really amazing. And I really can't wait for our listeners to get to know you a little bit more today. Well, before we get into the discussion, right? What's something about you that we wouldn't find on Google, right? Because trust me, by the time I Googled Elliot, I mean, like dance, PhD in dance studies. I'm like, okay, there's definitely so much we can learn from you, but something that we wouldn't find on Google.
I think what you won't find on Google is that I started out in television. I think
Mm,
there's very little about that. I started out in television in Nigeria. So I my first job was a production assistant for the late Michael Enahuru in Lagos. So
oh, wow.
television roots.
You say that, and it also kind of took me down memory lane. I also started like my career in on radio.
Okay.
But yeah, no, really amazing. And honestly, I think if anybody who is listening, just Google Dr. Fumi Elliott, and you'll be amazed at what.
Really. And after this, I'll probably Google myself now.
I think you should. There's really some amazing things about you there. Like I said, I got to learn a new word by just googling you, so that's how fascinating it is. Let's kind of go into like what you do. For people who do not know you right? Dr. Fumi Elliott is a UK-based performer. She's a dramaturge and a researcher, right? And you have an MA in post-colonial studies and a professional certificate in education and a PhD in dance studies. And we're going to situate our conversation around dance, but also looking at the creative sector in Africa today and to
Yeah.
really get your perspective on that. It's quite fascinating how you have been able to position dance as an embodied and almost, spiritual experience, right? So I think the first question for me is why dance? How did you come about dance? Not just as something you do, but as something you love. What is your story with dance? I think
Okay.
people would really love to know that.
I was born in Britain and my family moved back to Nigeria. My parents were the generation that went to Britain in the 60s to study. And I think that's the experience of quite a lot of people. And we moved back to Nigeria in 1977. I was around 8 years old at the time. And I couldn't speak Yoruba language, so that was the first challenge I had. One way of being included was to dance. I think as Yoruba people, we like to rib each other a lot. We like to make fun of each other a lot. So as soon as I spoke, hey, Omajabata, hey, so, but if I danced, people just danced with you.
Mm,
And so it became a place of communication. Also, I'd go out with my mother and, she would say, when we're leaving an uncle's house, didn't you hear me when I was telling you not to go and play outside? And I was like, no. Then she said, you didn't see me
no.
do my mouth like this? Like, really?
Typical
So
African parents.
yeah, so I became very conscious of the physical
Mm,
communication as a result of lacking in the verbal.
yeah.
And then also, I used to enjoy coming home from school and putting on the television and dancing along with the bands that were being shown on the videos. And I think one of my most powerful experiences when I was really young, it was the 70s, is to see clips of Festac 77, which was this huge
Mm,
festival on television. I went to University of Ibadan to study languages, but I remember very my first few days in the campus, I walked through the theatre and I just saw somebody flying through the sky. I was looking through a rehearsal window and there were people drumming and, people dancing. And I was like, wow, what was this? So even though I was a language student, I spent most of my time hanging around the theatre. Most people thought I was a theatre student. So dance had something very much to do with me about communication, connection. I was curious about my culture. My inroads to understanding Nigeria came through reading literature and through the theatre. So it was with connecting with the environment, also understanding the people and becoming, because in a way I had to become a Nigerian because I was born in Britain. It was a way into all of this, and I realized in reflection that it gave me a lot of stability, dancing.
Yeah, it's just really interesting when you say that because I know Nigerians are unforgiving when you're not like fully. They have this very sarcastic way of
Right.
making you feel like you don't belong or you belong. So I can definitely understand that. So for you, dance was a form of expression because
Yeah.
did you feel like you needed to find yourself like within that space and within trying to fit in? Was it that for you, like you
Yeah.
utilizing the tool of dance as a form of identity and trying to know who
Yeah,
you are?
it was a form of connection. I found that it's a funny one because how you move and how you dance, how you walk. I remember someone saying, "Oh, he's definitely Igbo." I said, "How do you know?" Look at the way he walks, you know. And then you look and you think, "Oh yeah, he walks in a particular way, and that person's Yoruba, they walk in a particular way, and that you become sensitive to gait and to gesture and to facial expression and all of this. So it was a way of interacting, it was a way of connecting. I found also that I use those examples of how do you identify people from how they move. I could never be the village girl that grew up and therefore understood all the cultural references. So in a way, it was a place where I experienced a lot of rejection and a lot of judgment. Oh, her sense of rhythm is a bit off. Don't you, hey, lady, you can't hear the drum. The drum was giving you a signal. It was a place where I realized I didn't have that background. Because when we arrived in Nigeria, I grew up in Lagos. My mother was from a royal household in Ile-Ife. So there was all kinds of references that I came to understand very young that even though we were both speaking English, we had very different frames of reference.
Mm.
And so I knew it was not going to make me fit in. I learned very quickly, but it would allow me to have a conversation.
That's quite interesting. I mean, I can just imagine that as a young creative, being able to kind of navigate all of that. It must have been challenging, especially when you're amongst your people. But I think we'll come to touch on that a little bit later when we talk about African dance and the power dynamics around that in contemporary world that we have today. With all of that, right? Growing your history in dance and your experience with dance, what is dance to you and how has that understanding changed over time and what has shaped it?
Well, in the beginning, dance was fun. It was, stress relief. As I say, it was a way of connecting with people. You know, um, it was a language in that way. And then as time went on, as I started to study dance, it became a way of understanding society. I think my background, which I found culturally complex, dance became a lens by which I could understand that complexity. I suppose I'm very interested in sociology, I'm very interested in psychology, and dance is a way into understanding that. It's a form of storytelling because if you look at how dance migrates and changes and transmutes, even within the country, you find to tell the story of that dance, you end up telling the story of generations and intergenerational shifts. There's a project I hope I'll be able to do in future, which I call A Different Kind of Dancing. It's built around a discussion between me and my mother. My mother loved to dance, and if you went with her to an event and you didn't dance, she would feel, oh my goodness, you let the side down. You let all your friends were up there with the drummers or the musicians and you were sitting in the corner. You need to go out and show who you are. However, when I said I want to work in dance, I want to do a PhD in dance, it was like, why? What? You go to university, you study dance. I mean, I'm even a better dancer than you. I mean, what, you know, what? And I realized it was that I was working in dance as a profession. That was not a concept from my mother's generation. Few people did that. I mean, my mother, she loved Herbert Ogunde, in the 40s. He's known as the first Nigerian to start a theatre company. She liked his work, but very few people did that. In fact, that was almost a family thing. Did you come from a family of performers? But to choose dance as a profession, go to university to study that, it was unheard of. And that made me look at why would a generation, my parents' generation who loved dance, not see it as a viable a professional option. One thing is it's very difficult in terms of making money. So that's one thing, and every parent wants their children to have a profession that earns an income. But also because dance, as I met it in Nigeria, had entered into a new context. For example, the National Dance Ensemble, or the National Ensemble in Nigeria, they were the first people, I think, to start being called to become civil servants. So if you joined the National Theatre, you became a civil servant.
I
So
didn't know that.
you could learn a dance in your village or as part of your family. You come in contact with an arts council officer. They audition you. They think you're fantastic. And the next thing, you're in the capital of the country in the National Theatre on a pay scale. That didn't happen the generation before. And it was that shift into the context of work, what we are now calling the creative economy. This is where I connected with dance, because I connected with it through bands in Lagos, through university curriculum, through theatrical stages. Yes, I went to festivals in my hometown, like the Olojo Festival, where I saw people doing traditional dances related maybe to religion or to the community. But my contact with dance came through these avenues: TV, the screen, popular culture, the theatre. And that was a completely different system to how my mother connected with dance. And so we're talking about the same dance steps, but we're not talking about it with the same currency.
Yeah.
And we have not really written or examined that shift. The fact that we have a creative industry hasn't removed traditional dance festivals. They are living in parallel, and there are performers that work between them. They dance in a festival in their village, maybe in Ijebuode, and the next day they're in the National Theatre on stage performing the same dance,
Mm.
but it's to a different kind of audience under different circumstances. And this is why I say understand the shift in dance, and you understand the story of Nigeria, you understand the story of post-colonial Africa, because it is this shifting across context, looking the same but having different functions in different places.
Does that then mean that we can't have like a single definition of, what dance is? Because from what you're saying, it kind of shifts based off like place, but also in terms of the performance. Like, how
Yeah.
should we understand that?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, if you come to many dance conferences I've been in the past, yeah, there's constant debates. What is African dance? There's no such thing. Some people will argue there's no such thing as African dance. Africa is a continent. You can't have one dance. Then some people will say, don't you understand that when we are saying African dance, we're really saying Pan-African dance. That means dance productions which, are made for stage, and therefore they have this focus which is pan-African. And some people say no, it is incorrect, you should call the dance the name. But no, you can't call it that name, because once you put it on stage, a maiden dance, which is danced by women that are not married on stage, married women with 3 children are dancing the maiden dance, you can't call it that. Yeah. So we've gone to places with all these kind of debates. In fact, as Africans, we should even use the word dance. Africans don't just separate one art form for another. If you go to an African festival, dance, poetry, spectacle are all mixed together. So this idea of separating it into separate things, this is a Western idea. So we should even say dance. I don't even call myself a dancer. I'm only here because so you hear all these kind of debates. for the very reasons you're saying, because once you shift context, and there's some people
Mm,
working in three of such contexts at the same time, which is a
mm,
complexity that you do not experience in Europe. That's why I say, if you to start understanding the shifts and the change in discourse and philosophy that happens when a dance moves from one context to another, you begin to understand the complexity of culture in Africa. Because
yeah.
sometimes when we talk about culture in Africa, we want to talk only about pre colonial culture, aspects of life that existed pre colonially and may continue today, but we say that is the real African culture. But I would argue that history has to be thought about in periods. And there are cultures that popped up in 2000, there are cultures that popped up last year. Afrobeats didn't exist pre colonial. Where does it belong? It's African. Yes, it has influences from everywhere else, but you can't tell me it's the same thing as the popular music we're experiencing coming from European artists or Asian artists.
Mm,
No. So some people are now arguing that there's a concept called global Africa. Global
interesting.
Africa, which produces cultures which are global. I go online, I see enough white girls and Asian men dancing coupe de Calais and Afro beats. I'm coming to Nigeria to learn more in Abuja and and in Lagos.
Mm.
So this is a globalized African culture, which is
Yeah,
African.
that's quite interesting, and I think we'll touch on that when we come to talk about like the ethics of creativity, and looking at today's pop culture, for instance, and what does that mean? Like, are there forms of cultural appropriation in this thing we call art that should be a heavily subjective form of expression? Like, where do we balance being creative, right, as some type of creative freedom, but then how do you balance that, or how do you situate that within the context of creativity that doesn't lead to harm, but also creativity that respects origin? So I mean, there's a
Yeah,
lot of debate around
there's a
that,
lot
but,
of
but
debates about that. I think
yeah.
it's difficult to broach that discussion unless we
Mm,
begin to accept there's differences in context. You
mhm,
know, I have an issue with people telling me that a theatrical practice is the same as a traditional practice, even if you're using the same forms. There's overlaps, no doubt,
mhm,
but they're working under different terms of reference, can I say, or unspoken rules.
mm,
And if you want to start thinking about ethics, you're really thinking about where and how and with who. And so if we don't accept that when you're training to be a professional dancer, you're training to work in particular ways, then you can't really build a sense of ethics. And that's why I think it's very important that we start recognizing dance in Nigeria as a professional practice. And people who say we do not talk about dance as a separate thing in Africa, yes and no. Because if I was to go into certain contexts, maybe they don't talk about dance as a separate thing. But as soon as, if I think of my growing up in the 1970s, we started having King Sunny Ade, having dancers on stage, people started saying, that's a dancer. As the industry evolved, concepts of being a dancer did evolve. So we have to think about context and periods. In terms of ethics, the whole thing about cultural appropriation is very interesting. It's also historical. We really talk about it a lot now. In the 80s and 90s, people were trying to think of the idea of one Nigeria, one unity, the idea of swapping dance forms and cultures was supported in this idea that, as a Yoruba woman, I will learn Igbo dances, I will learn Hausa dances, I will learn dances from Sapele, I will learn, you know, and that was the whole idea of having a national dance national ensemble, is that you could go, it's the only place you could go and see a vision of the nation on stage was the theater. That is the place I could see a dance, Idoma dance. That is the place I could see a dance from Gimbu. That's the dance where I could see a Hausa dance. Otherwise, do you think I can just wander into a Hausa village and start dancing with them? No. But this was to give us an idea of civil society and the nation. Now we start having other issues arising with the internet. Also, can you control that? There's enough people learning dances from all over the world from the internet.
Yeah.
So when it comes to the ethics, I have found that people argue around appropriation. It really comes to two areas. I think a lot to do with finance, because we have situations where an outsider to the culture learns aspects of the culture and now becomes the expert of the culture. And maybe because they have better connections, they have more institutional, and then they now put out of business people from that culture and become the face of it. And that's where, these issues arise. And in those issues, I would suggest that, let me say, I am not from that culture, but I'm performing in it. I would say do it in collaboration with people, so that it doesn't become a situation where you become the spokesperson for a culture that you are not part of, and cause offense. You might not even plan to do that. It might be that the media is attracted to you, you know? So that's one thing. There's the other thing where people deliberately appropriate, we all appropriate, by the way. I think the real term is misappropriation, but
Yeah.
because we all borrow from each other, there's a situation where I could go to somebody else's culture, create a technique from their culture, a methodology, and then
Hmm.
come and say, I am the author of it, cutting out the fact that I actually did research in a particular cultural field and I've created a methodology, and I don't cite them. Now, some people don't want to cite them because they think that will create demands on them. Once I start saying, oh, I studied, I went and learned, took a dance from Benin and I studied it, I created my new methodology, the Fumi Benin dance methodology, then Benin people might rise up and say, hang on, what do we get out of this? So sometimes there's a fear of that. And so artists think, "Ah, I've done it, it's a precarious career. I've done it to give myself an income, and now some other people want to claim it. So sometimes they cut out those people. And sometimes people from that area say, no, 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 we don't want your money, but we want to be cited. We want it to be recognized that we invented these dances, or these dances came from our culture. So you can see that economics really sometimes is really entwined with this, as well as legacy. Because, if my cultural legacy is sometimes erased and they're now attributing things that came from my cultural background to to someone else, then it's like we didn't exist, we didn't contribute, we had no option. So this issue of recognition and economics is huge around this discussion of appropriation, and I don't think it's something we can stop. I think, like you say, maybe bring in ethics, but that comes with acknowledging there's an industry in the first place, because you have to have a place you bring the ethics to. You're not
Hmm.
bringing the
Yeah.
ethics to um, people who dance socially and recreationally, because those things don't bother them usually.
I think that's quite interesting, but I really love to get your take on these arguments in terms of, is there anything that we can call African dance, right? Who gets to define what authentic African dance is, right? And as you're speaking, I was also having this thought in my head. Then, what's more important? Is it the form or representation? And when you also talk about how it's possible to pick a traditional dance and then it goes to, you present that dance in a different stage and then you infuse it with other forms of dance, and then it's like, isn't that some form of erasure in some sense? But I would really love to get your take on some of these thoughts in terms of like form,
Yeah,
representation. Can dance ever be neutral? Is it possible? What is African dance? Well, how should we
yeah.
understand?
I'll take the what is African dance. I mean, I've heard people say recently, oh, don't use the term Africa is a continent, it's not a country. And when you say African dance, it's like you're reducing everything down. Well, the people who've started using, the discourse around African dance comes from three places. Three places I'm aware of. One, you had colonial officers writing about Africans, and therefore they were looking for particular traits that defined African lifestyles, and that was so they can control. Because, for example, if they found out something was a taboo amongst certain people, they will say, okay, if you disobey us, we will force you to participate in something that is a taboo to you. So by understanding the culture, you knew what kind of punishments or regulations you could bring in. And the idea of Africa, some ideas of what African dance is came from there. But you have a lot of idea about the African dance coming from people who were promoting culture at independence. At independence, remember, 1960, when Nigeria became independent, about 20 other African nations got independent, I think, in the same year. And then there were ideas like, let's have the United States of Africa, where, like America. So it's one country and each country is a state. And at that time, there was a lot of experiments with culture. There was airport dance, where traditional troops would go to the airport to greet dignitaries, taking ideas that would do in our communities into the civil society and the public sphere. In that time, the term African dance was really big, really promoted by Ghana, for example, under Nkrumah, who was really looking at, as the full name would be Pan-Africanist dance, if you wanted to call the full name, Mamre Apoku, who was commissioned by Nkrumah to set up the School of Theatre, was trying to train dancers so they could, a dancer from Ghana could dance all Ghanaian dances and learn techniques so he could dance all African dances. And at the time, and this is 1958, when I was reading articles written in 1958, people were saying, this is bastardization, this is dilution, don't do this. Not everybody was in agreement. But the idea was, when you bring it to theatre, these ideas of policy, of politics, of how do we manage the multiplicity and diversity of Africa, these ideas were part of that context, and within governments these were being produced. And then, with the development of urban life, with the fact that a lot of African artists started traveling, the idea of independent artists came about, where you are performing for yourself. You're not getting a salary from the national company, although unfortunately many national dance companies now are also freelance. At the time they were on salary, but the way you create your profession is going to be different. You're going to work on a level of collaboration. You're going to be testing the tastes of audiences. I would say, yes, the term African dance is very imprecise. I wouldn't say it's bad. I would say it's imprecise, but I don't think it's imprecise because of the term itself, but because of the discourse we put with the term. I'll explain. You open a dictionary for a word like light, and there's about 5 definitions. Light could be light. Light could be, this is heavy or light. Light could be all sorts of things. You have to have a discussion behind the language. We don't have those discussions, or we have those discussions, they're not well circulated. They're not part of our industry. They might be part of the academia where scholars are talking to themselves, but they're not part of the industry, and they need to be. The term African dance maybe be less contentious if we say Pan-African dance or intra-African dance, so people know that it's dances that people have developed, and it will change from context to context. If you're saying all Africans should only dances specifically one by one, if you're doing bata, only bata, don't mix it with atilogu, don't mix it with, I don't think this is real. It's not real. It's not, doesn't go with the lifestyle. Urban contexts are translocal. It doesn't even go with history. I mean, look at jollof rice. Just jollof rice. It was first called Wolof rice because it came from Wolof people from Senegal who were cooking rice in Nigeria. So people used to call it Wolof rice. It became jollof rice. If we now go and look at the rice of Wolof people, it's brown. Jollof rice is red. So we've changed it over time.
Yeah.
and we've made it something else. So this is life. Even our clothes, the damask, the Ankara, many of these were produced in Britain and repurposed and, we
Mm.
incorporated them into our culture. In Midwest Nigeria, people wear top hats and bowler hats. These are English, but they don't wear it the way an English person would. So
But
we
yeah.
have this even in our traditional, even in what we call our traditions. My
Mm.
mother used to love coral beads. I found out she bought the whole lot from Italy. Yet
Mm.
she wears it in a way that Italians don't wear it. So something within her aesthetic world that she could bring this into her perspective. So I
Mm.
don't think it makes sense to police dance and say everybody should dance separately. We can't mix things. It becomes erasure because we don't write about it. We don't develop a discourse about it. Over periods of time, new professions arise. We don't put anything down about how people work. And so what happens is that creators begin to hide their methodologies because they are fearing they're going to be criticized.
It's quite interesting because I've read a few things that you've written. You also see dance as a form of knowledge production,
Yeah.
right? And when you just touch on that thing around like erasure, like who is defining the methodology, who is writing about it, who is talking about it. How do you think like young creatives living in this world of like, where we're mixing different things too? Because I really think that it's hard to pin it down to one thing, because the creative space in itself even is heavily subjective. It's like what my art might mean for me might just be how I see the world. It's different from how you might interpret it. So it's very, very subjective in that sense. But how do you think creatives need to begin to think about like creativity, be it dance, be it poetry, whatever form of art that they're involved in, around this concept of knowledge generation, like especially with young people, like what would you want them to take away from that? Like, how do we shape the narrative, from an African perspective, and really helps generate that knowledge that you just touched on?
The first thing we need to do is strengthen what we call the African perspective, because what is that? I'm not saying there isn't one. Sometimes we look to history for perspectives to say, I'm part of this continuum that I've experienced, to locate yourself in history. And that gives you a perspective. When you have examples of how maybe your elders or people who went before you or other industries, how they did it and why they did it, you can begin to start saying, okay, this is how I do it. It's a bit similar to them, a bit different, and you can see
Mm.
yourself in a continuum because things will change when economic situations change,
Mm.
when political situations change, our lifestyles will change, and therefore our practices change. So to pin people to a certain kind of way of practicing when everything around them is changing is a way of shutting down everybody's creativity and problem solving abilities and even well being. So, really, what we have to capture in an African perspective is the knowledge we produce in how to deal with change, on how we deal with change. Because, as we say, the only thing permanent is change. It's going to change. And if we consider history or culture to be something that happened pre 1904 or 1805, all the way back, then we ignore different people bring to the cultural industries. And you need those stories to have a sense of what perspective is,
Yep.
you know, and to know and to also see what inspired other people and how they created from that inspiration in view of how they were living or where they were living. So I think that African perspective, we owe younger generations that perspective. We owe them that history. We owe them the stories of how we managed it or created it or what the work environment is. And then yes, you can bring in ideas of ethics and But you also know that when you're working in the creative industries, yes, you start off, it's about your self-expression and your self-expression, your self-expression. And then gradually you begin to start thinking, I have to think about an audience. I have to think about the work environment I'm working, and all these other things come in. And so there has to be a
Mhm.
sense of that. I think these ways of thinking are important to hand down, because Nigeria, we have creativity coming out of being creative is not our problem. You know,
Yeah.
it's not our problem. We create constantly and all the time. We do not document it very well, and we do not create a situation where people can understand what they're doing. I mean, when you talk about knowledge generation, in a simple fact, let's look at what everybody does: trial and error. You know, I do a dance in front of the audience today. No one clapped. Okay. Tomorrow I change something else. They clapped a bit small. Okay. But I didn't like the message I was given. Okay. So we think of a way of how we're going to weave a message in. And
Mhm.
gradually over a period of time, we create something which is maybe socially relevant and enjoyable. There was a process that happened of trial and error, of talking to the audience, of talking to creatives, talking to each other, and we might develop a format that works. Okay, we start making our plays or dance dramas with that format. We've
Mhm.
created a lot of knowledge about composition, relating with the audience, relating with other collaboration methods, and on how to get a message, maybe a political message, across in a way that people find it palatable enough to absorb and think about. We've created a lot of knowledge on how to do it, and as soon as that organization disbands, that knowledge is dissipated. And the next group of people that rise up, they start trial and error again to create something again. So that's one way of thinking about knowledge generation, is that people have to understand that the methods and the processes that they develop in order to arrive at their performance is valuable. Is valuable in order to train others, in order to refine and consolidate. And
Mhm.
more and more is important to own. You know, I was talking about the precarity of artists, you know, where I am in England, we're talking a lot about artist frameworks and methods. Because artists are freelance or independent and working with different organizations constantly, if they have a framework by which they base their work on, they are more able to do that. So if I have a framework on how I put a performance together, it's easier for me to work with a school today, work with
Okay.
another professional company tomorrow, because it means I sit down, look at my framework, and start again. But if I'm told that the only thing that is important is tradition, if I'm told the only thing that's important that is continuity of tradition, then will I be documenting my framework? No. I will make one up because it would be impossible to do the job without one. You have to have a method to be doing the job. So you'll make one up. But the only thing you will document is the tradition that it was handed to you, not how you're using the tradition, not the impact the tradition is making. Because even those that put on stage traditional dances, which they learnt in their homesteads or within a hometown context, when they put it on stage, they reframe it. There's actually a method on how to present traditional dances on stage to look like they have not been framed. That is a great skill. That is a great skill. It needs to be passed down. But most of my seniors who know how to do that retired with that knowledge.
Mm. Wow.
So
That's
that's what I'm saying. And the knowledge of making gives you a knowledge of society. So it's not only about the artistic performance you create. In learning to create a performance, especially if you're African and you're working with dances that developed within social contexts and you're working with them in the creative industry, especially, you create knowledge on society in general.
I think that's really powerful. And I don't know if when artists from Africa create, they create, with that sense of knowing. Because like what you just explained now is just really fascinating. As you're speaking, I'm also seeing like there's a huge value chain within the creative space that a lot of professionals can tap into, from knowledge generation to frameworks and how that's even developed, and how that can be replicated in other spaces and all that. I'm just thinking like there's a whole lot of work here that needs to
Yeah,
be done.
but
Yeah.
like with everything, people become specialists on different aspects. So
Yeah.
you would find, like, my last visit to Nigeria, I met some amazing creatives in Lagos and Abuja, and what will happen is that everybody starts out dancing, but after some
Mm,
time some people will think, I prefer the management of dance. I like shaking a leg once in a while, but I prefer managing dance. And somebody else says, I prefer researching it. Or
mm,
I'd like to switch between documentation and between documenting dance, making documentaries about dance, and performing.
yeah.
And that's why I think a wide picture of what is possible around dance is necessary. I met one young man called Faith Oko, who's really interested in dance documentation. He's a dancer himself. But if they have no role modeling, there's no sense of this is a possibility, then people begin to think, well, you dance, and then when you get to a certain age and you feel you're too old to be doing this, you drop out, or you do something else. Whereas actually, there's other avenues you can take the knowledge of being a dancer into. You could take them more in the way of media or socially or community engagement. What I mean? There's different ways, health and well-being, you know,
Mm,
there's different ways you could, places you can take. So we have to get a bigger picture of what's possible for people to know how they can develop maybe a longer career within dance.
yeah, no, I think that's very important because while you're talking, I remember, I think it was 2 years ago, I was looking for some evidence around like spoken word poetry in Africa, for instance. And there's limited literature around that. And that's a growing like creative art form, right, in the whole of the continent. And I don't know if there's anybody actually sitting down to study it, to like do some
The
research.
thing is, we don't document our professional practice. I think it
Mm,
sometimes comes from the idea that because many of these frameworks, institutional settings like the university, the civil service, the primary school, the secondary school, they were originally European frameworks or institutions, and they came into the country via colonialism.
mm,
And I think because of that, we ignore them. We ignore what we do inside these places. We
mm.
see the only thing of value is what we do of the people outside these spaces. So what we do in our villages, or what we do in popular culture or in our communities, that's valuable. But once we start doing something within an office, or we start doing something within a theater, or we start doing something in a university, we then say, this is westernized. And
Mm,
because it's westernized, we are not studying it. We are not documenting it. I think there's a lot of that mindset around, which I think doesn't help us at all, because the way we run universities, the way we produce knowledge with poetry, the way we work with English language is not as the West does.
yep.
And so even if it arrived as a result of the West, if you take it back to the West, they'll tell you very clearly it is African. They do not work with English the way we work with even the English language.
It might not necessarily be that it's from the West. It's possible that there's a form of that in our history that probably we don't have a name of what it is. But then studying that helps you understand that there's a deep rooted history in this art form that probably, has not been studied. And then
Yeah,
we need to.
I agree, Patience, but I also want to say there's things that we create, and we should not say that things, the only things valuable from Africa are the things that predate the 18th century. So unless you are able to prove that it has a far away historical root, it's only then it's valuable. So the only so if we want to justify doing spoken word, we have to say it came from Ewi. And if we don't say that, then it's not of any valuable value. I have a problem with that because, different generations will connect with culture differently. Now,
Mm.
I was in the Association of Nigerian Authors when I was in Nigeria in the 80s. And we used to perform poetry all the time. In fact, I was the artistic director of the Poetry Club of the University of Ibadan. So in terms of spoken word, we were doing it. In fact, at the time, we used to call it performance poetry more because it took more of an idea from performing with music, performing with, so like the dub poets or the jazz poets,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. But I was a performance poet. And when I came to Britain, I started out in slams, in poetry slams, based
Mm.
on what I used to do in UI. And I won. And for about 3 years, I was doing performance. Well, I was coming from my performance poetry roots, which I learnt at the university. But I just got into the spoken word field, and this came from what I'd learned in literature, African literature, and
Mm.
theatre in Nigeria. I speak to a lot of creatives, and they'll say, "Oh, it came out of a university system, and therefore it's not valuable. But to make it valuable, I have to go and find the historical roots." Yes, yes, I'm sure finding the historical roots will enrich it, but it doesn't mean it's not valid in its own right. And I think there is a discounting. We erase ourselves by saying that these things are not valuable because they came out of 2025 or 2020. So it's not valuable. I have to find its roots before it's valuable. If you do not take it as valuable, you will not find its roots because you
Mm.
have to research that thing that you're doing in the present to find how it links to anything in the past and how you can use it in the future. So if you ignore the present, which I think we do a lot of, we do not produce a history. And I will say that with great confidence, having lived it for over 40 years. Why don't we have African languages in our curriculums?
Yeah.
Why are people being born into Lagos now that don't speak Yoruba, don't speak English properly, don't speak Yoruba properly, don't speak any African language properly? Why why doesn't it happen? Is it because we've not translated them into curriculums? Is it because we have not said, let's have slam poetry in Yoruba? Or
Mm.
let's create a competition. The best person to do slam poetry in the Yoruba language gets a prize. Do you think people won't quickly go off and quickly do it? Because that's what motivates young people. Because they can
Yeah.
see a future, they can see a possibility. We don't do that. We go, oh, the young people nowadays, nobody knows their traditional dance. Kini kon, kini kon. Where is the competition for the best traditional dancer? I went somewhere and somebody was saying we had to talk about Western agencies. They're colonizing Nigerian dances. First of all, Nigerians are not that easy to colonize. You are saying that there is one Western agency giving a dance a prize for contemporary dance. And how many universities do we have with theatre arts departments? And that one agency should terrify us. Why? Let them give prizes. We are not giving any prizes though. And then somehow you want to say that learning these forms of culture are valuable when there's no prizes attached to them. There's no accolades given to the people that know them, and the only people that benefit from the traditional culture are those who find a way to make it commercial. We have to value the present, or we're not gonna have a history. We do not value the present. I repeat, we will not have a history because you have to connect what you're doing at present to a past. So if you don't look at the present, there is no past that you can connect it to.
Absolutely. And today's present is tomorrow's history. So
Abio, exactly.
I think it's quite fascinating and just really interesting. I feel like I'm in a public lecture where you're giving the lecture and you're telling me more and more about dance and your perspective. See, but I think that's quite a fascinating take on it around like knowledge creation and how we should understand whatever it is that we're creating within the present and not always kind of situate that in the past. I think there's something we need to touch on around like the creative economy. We hear a lot about how the creative sector is the second largest employer of labor in Nigeria after agriculture, right? And we see the soft power of the creative space that Nigeria, is becoming this really huge global exporter of, of creativity. But a lot of young people who do not see themselves in how that economy is booming, right? Because, like you've also alluded to, you're a young creative, emerging creative somewhere, you're really struggling to make a living out of like, whatever it is that you're creating. Um, what do you think? So many artists are still struggling. So I think my question to you, as someone who has probably, you lived in Nigeria, you've seen how the whole creative space work, you've engaged with like young creatives from, across the continent. How do we bridge that gap between being creative, a booming creative economy, but at the same time, I'm not able to financially sustain myself as a young emerging creative.
I think one thing that people need to know is the same everywhere. I think once you realize it's the same everywhere, then it takes the pressure off. In Britain, creatives are asking the same question.
Mm,
People I've met in other European countries are asking the same question: how do you sustain yourself as a creative? Because of the kind of industry it is, which is built on culture. And when I say built on culture, I'm talking about lifestyles, networks, you know,
mhm,
a lot of who you know and who you can collaborate with. It's a difficult one because some of those things are difficult to monetize. I find, for example, if someone asks me to come and give a class and they give me a brief and they say, oh, this is what my students want to know, I do tons of work before I even enter that class to be able to give the kind of workshop they want.
mhm,
And all that kind of tons of work I'm doing, some of it is very difficult to monetize. People employing you on very small budgets.
yeah.
I have a theatre show, a solo show, which I want to perform. And because I want to perform it late in the year, I'm starting to plan it and talk to people 5, 6 months before. And the time I'm using that, I'm not using it to earn. So first of all, this is the nature of the industry. And
Mhm,
I think that it's something to navigate. One, and then you have to also think about how do you want to be in the industry, because there's different kinds of professions. And I think the young creators have to understand that. There's some people, they get into a theatre group and they can make a whole career with that theatre group and never step out of it.
mhm,
And you might see that and like it and find that you're not somehow getting into that position. And then you think, what's the position I am in? If you're someone that is answering audition calls, then you have to realize that probably will not sustain you unless you're able to develop a star persona, and
mm,
then people employ you because they know if you're in their film or in their play, there will be audience. So at some point, one has to decide what kind of creative I am.
mm,
And one way people sustain their career is to have several threads to their bow. You have what they call a portfolio career, and more people are planning their artistic career with that in mind. So I was talking to a graduate who was about to leave university, having studied dance and teaching. I said, what you planning to do next? She said, oh, I would take an MA in nutrition and I will open a wellness outfit where people can come and dance, take dance classes, also receive their nutritional plan, and then maybe once a year I would do an outdoor show. So she had from the beginning, and I think more and more young creators are thinking like that, less like my generation that thought you graduate, you turn up with your CV, try and get one job, and you know and work in that industry. They're actually thinking multiple, and I think this is caused by the internet, There was
Mm,
nothing like the creator's economy when I was
mm,
growing up. Now people think of the creative economy, but they're also thinking of the creator's economy, how you can actually develop your own brand online and develop an audience. So I would say to young creators, realize there's several options, understand what kind of artist you are. Some artists are really out there. They are, they're exhibitionist, they can pull the focus, they enjoy pulling the focus, and they're likely to become stars and have that star quality and therefore be able to sustain a career that way. If you're a more intellectual kind of artist, you might think, I need to combine this with an academic career, or combine it with journalism, or combine it with blogging and media. And if you
mhm,
find that you're somebody that you're more handcrafty, you might decide, let me go into hair, fashion alongside it, and then learn to plan your year so you have times where you do one or the other. But this idea you shouldn't have the idea you need to suffer for your art. Your art instead should infuse all that you do, so you have an artistic practice. How does it inform different things? Remember, if you're selling clothes, those same people you're selling clothes to could come to your show tomorrow, you know
yeah.
so Beyonce, we forget that even people like Beyonce, they have clotheslines, they sell perfume, they sell makeup, they do all sorts of things. They don't just sit on the fact, because they know at one point in their life they may not want to or be able to do what they're doing now, so they have to learn about investment and a lot of things behind the scenes. But we tend to, and that's why the sense of industry and profession needs to grow, so that people can join an association where these kind of topics are discussed, and then they
Mhm,
can take responsibility for their own career planning,
mm.
because no one's going to do it for them.
Yeah, I think Africa needs you, Dr. Fumi, especially in building and creating that industry, and how we need to begin to think and see ourselves in an industry and not just as solo artists. Because, I mean, I started out as a spoken word poet, and I can't tell you the last time I performed on stage, right? But there's also that struggle or contention about trying to balance multiple priorities. I mean, you have a
Yeah,
day's, you're trying to run a creative organization, you're trying to, you're also trying to be a creative, and there are people who have argued that, trying to do all of these multiple things then impacts on like the creative side of you and all. And there are people
yeah,
who are able to manage it all, but there are people who struggle. Like, I'm still struggling to find my way back to poetry again. uh, but let's kind of shift from that and really talk about something you're working on, which is the Creative Sphere Africa. And we're really looking forward to it. But it's been nice if our audience get to know a little bit more about what you're planning to do with Creative Sphere Africa. What should we be looking out to? What's on the horizon? Because I'm so excited, and I just feel like I can come to any lecture Dr. Fumi is,
oh, thank
speaking
you.
at, because there's definitely so much to learn. And I think emerging creatives from Africa really need to hear you talk, hear and learn from you. So maybe tell us a bit more about Creative Sphere Africa.
Oh, yeah. So Creative Africa is an NGO that I'm in the process of setting up. um I'm setting up because of some of the things we're talking about today. I think I have gained some experience from having grown up in Nigeria and then moved to Britain, but have kept, connection between Nigeria and Britain, and realized that it's become more and more of a global space. The arts is a transnational as well as a translocal location. It's an awareness of that location that will help people with the planning of their careers. That's one. So one thing I want to do is actually do some events that will be supporting careers of of artists by having these kind of discussions so that people can plan, but also promote creativity as part of everyday life. So there's lots of people who are creative who are not going to have creative careers and don't want a creative career. They're happy being a doctor or a lawyer or a bus driver, but creativity helps them, and that also should be nurtured, so that, because sometimes there's a bad thing about creativity. It will drag you away from a straight path in life to make and help you make stupid decisions. But if it's seen as something that we all do, which we all do, then we realize it's something we have choices with. So that's one thing I also want to do, and also promote how we use creativity in areas which are not necessarily called creative, like the science, or like health. Well, in Nigeria now, there's a lot of arts and health projects, starting, um, but also in conflict resolution, how creativity can be used in these places, because we have examples of having done them in Nigeria. They are not just documented as such; they're not platformed or made visible. So we know that these are mechanisms. So hopefully, to do something to support creatives, but also do something to promote creativity as something that can answer to some of our some of the things we're trying to develop, and context we're trying to develop within the country.
Mm. And are you looking to do this just in Nigeria, or are you looking beyond Nigeria and that could
It
expand?
is very funny. When I started, that's why I called it Create Sphere Africa. I thought, oh, this would be great across the continent. And then I thought, oh my goodness, this is over ambitious. So I wrote back to the lawyer and said, can you drop the Africa from the title and just call it Create Sphere? And the lawyer didn't see the email or ignored the email. So it still came back Create Sphere Africa. So I thought, oh, maybe I'm stuck with this transnational thing. But my plan is to focus on Nigeria, and then gradually form alliances with people in other parts of the continent, and maybe even the diaspora, depending. But my focus is what goes on in continental Africa, in the continent of Africa. That is really my focus.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, we're really looking forward to the events and activities that you put together. And I do think it's a benefit creatives from across the continent, not just Nigeria alone. With today's, global, like they say, the world is becoming more and more, global in that
Globally,
sense.
yeah. I mean, I had some amazing lecturers, and I grew up around amazing artists on television. I really would like to talk about them, talk about the people that really inspired me. And here also, and because when I've spoken to some young artists in Nigeria, they've never heard of Baba Sala. Baba Sala? I don't know. Do you know Baba Sala? He's a
Yeah.
comedian. Yeah, some people have never heard of him. I thought it was amazing. People like that I grew up with on television, or people that wrote articles for paper. I mean, as Nigerians, we're sophisticated creatives, but then
Mm,
this just sort of disappears, and the next people think they're starting from scratch. Whereas if they knew of these other case studies, these
mm-hmm,
other people, they realize that, you know what, I don't have to start from scratch. I can start from where they left off, and
mm-hmm.
then and then they can avoid some of the mistakes we made as well.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's really important. I think with what Creative Sphere Africa is doing, because I sometimes think that element of mentorship is kind of missing, especially among young creatives or emerging creatives coming up today. It's like you say, they feel like they're starting from nothing. But just hearing you talk about performance poetry and how that's something you were heavily involved in just makes me realize, okay, maybe we need to have another side chat to really understand, yeah, because I do agree, like my first encounter with it, or my understanding coming to spoken word poetry, was from that sense of performance poetry. And someone who is good in like drama can actually do a spoken word and perform it,
Mm,
because it's really that performance that uses every part of your body to really drive home a
yeah.
message beyond just your voice and all. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to what you
Mm.
do with Creative Spare Africa, and we're very much on board to support the initiative that you
Can
put.
I just say one more thing? I
Mhm.
think alongside, in this sort of global situation we're in, and this sort of creators economy that we're dealing with within the creative economy, I think one thing that creatives should learn or align themselves with someone who knows is how to develop their own platforms, and how to develop their own structures to work in. Because if you're an accountant, you get the structure given to you by your office. But as a creative, you have to create it. And if five artists come together and say, let's create a collective for 3 years. And in this collective, we will you're the poet, I'm the dancer. We'll do some collective works maybe once a year, and but we'll also support each other when they do
Mm,
something single. So if someone says, oh, I'm a poet, and one of you says, I'm a costume designer, I will design your costume free of charge or at a discount, because you're going to come and open the show for me when I'm doing my singing.
mm,
And you do some exchanges until, because usually when you're early career and you start like that, gradually each one of you will start finding your level. Maybe after 3 years the collective will dissolve because different people have found things to do, but to give you yourself that push, sometimes a
mm,
collective coming together where you can help and bounce off each other to start off. And there needs to be trust, and there needs to be maybe mentorship, but this
yeah,
is something that can help and also allow people who have full-time jobs to have a creative outlet for their creativity besides their job if they work with in a collective formation. But they have to organize this themselves.
yeah,
That's
absolutely.
one way.
Yeah, you see why we need a master class from you. All right, just to kind of wrap up, it's been a really interesting conversation, and we've gone way past time, but it
Yeah.
just tells you how much of an interesting conversation it's been. Um, so I think the other question I really like to ask is around like, to a young African dancer listening to this conversation, either listening from Jos or in Lagos or Port Harcourt, wherever they may be, what would you want them to hold on to? In thinking about creativity and how they are supposed to how they fit in the world today with everything going on.
My advice to them would be to study their environment for dance and study themselves,
Hmm.
and find out who's dancing around you, who's the producers, who are the shows, and see what you see how you can fit in or put yourself forward. But at the same time, study yourself. You might go into these places and find you don't fit in. You might find that they have skills you don't have. It might be an opportunity to learn those skills, but there might not be a way for you to learn those skills. Keep dancing and keep trying to find out what's unique about yourself. For example, I found out what's unique about me is that I combined movement with storytelling. That's my unique point. I'm not the best one doing pure traditional dances, but I'm quite strong in the combination of movement and dance. And then when you begin to find out what your thing is, hone it, you know? But the big thing is, don't put yourself in situations where you lose the love of dance, which can easily happen when you make it a job.
Mm.
So sometimes take a break from the hustle and just enjoy dance for what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. That's quite profound. And we always love to kind of close our podcast session with a question because we believe that as much as we're promoting creativity, at the foundation of that is having quality education. And I'm not just talking about formal education, we've just
Yeah.
talked about mentorship. And education can happen both formally and informally. And we'd love to ask our guests this question. What does quality education mean to you, and why do you think people should care?
Quality education for me is um, an education that teaches you how to evolve, teaching you how to connect with people,
Mm,
social skills, how to connect with people, how to value connection, how to value yourself and your own gifts, and also how to um, learn how to learn. Because, as I
mm,
say, I remember taking a business course once and we were writing business plans, and the person leading the course said, by the time you finish your plan, it's likely to be out of date. The prices you've put into the plan may have changed. The supplier
mm,
you wrote in the plan might have gone out of business. But the idea is to sort of understand the concepts behind that. So if the plan is out of date, you can look at the out of date information and say, I have an idea of what I need to do next or what I need to find out now. So
mm,
if a quality education could be one that would give the student those tools so that they have possibilities and options, and also which really puts value on themselves, because life is up and down, and if you haven't got a good sense of self-worth, it's easily to go down and not come up. So I
Yeah.
think a quality education, and that has to be between the school and the home and friends. So it can't just be only an institutional thing. It has to also come from the people surrounding, the student.
Interesting. I think that's the first time I'm hearing, your take on education about the ability to be able to help you learn how to learn. Because so oftentimes you hear like, it's about learning and unlearning, but how do you even learn? Is the way you learn the right way of learning, or could there be a better way of learning? So that's quite interesting. But yeah, it's been really awesome having you, Dr. Fumi. It's been an enriching conversation, and I feel like we'll probably need to have you back again for some type of masterclass with like young emerging creators, because I definitely feel and strongly see the need for mentorship, especially from people who have, been doing this for years. Like, what do we need to learn from an industry perspective? But also in terms of what it means to be creative in this world that we have today. So really, really appreciative of the fact that you spent some time to speak with us today.
Thank you very much. It's been great being here, and yes, I'll be very happy to be invited back at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. All right, I'll stop there and allow you to enjoy the rest of your day.
Well, thanks, Patience. This has been a really, really lovely discussion. Looking forward to hearing back from